So welcome again to this press briefing on the Arctic Alarm. I'm Zoe Antitch of Mission 2020 and the Campaign Collective. A couple of points on housekeeping. This call is being recorded and it will be made available afterwards on the Arctic Basecamp site, which is arcticbasecamp.org/media. So if you missed something that one of the speakers said, you'll be able to go to there later on and review the call. So just a bit of context for why this briefing has been convened. On Thursday this week, the UN General Assembly will hold a high-level climate summit, which many hope will reboot the COP26 process so we can get things back on track in terms of climate action and commitments under the Paris Agreement. And we thought it would be extremely helpful for reporters covering that meeting and the COP26 process to gain insights from experts on what's going on in the Arctic right now, and why that matters so much for government leaders, business leaders, investors, and citizens all around the world. So the extraordinary group of scientists who are with us on the line today are going to explain the science of Arctic ice loss, along with other impacts, including devastating heat and wildfires, and how these are all driving a world of worsening climate impacts. And we'll also hear from Nigel Topping, the high-level climate action champion for COP26, about what this all means for the leaders gathering in the UN General Assembly, as well as for the run-up to COP26, which is happening in November next year. Before I go into introducing the speakers, just to tell you how the call's going to flow, each speaker will have a window of between 3 to 5 minutes for their remarks. I'll be turning off my video when they're speaking. When I pop back up on video again, that means the speaker is reaching the end of their allotted time and will be asked to wrap up. After each speaker has provided their comments, we're then going to have an open period for questions, and we encourage you to ask questions as much as you can. The way to do that is going to be to type your question into the chat box, and when doing that, make clear which speaker it's intended for. And then when we're in the questions session, I'll make sure that as many of your questions as possible are asked and that the relevant speakers have an opportunity to respond. So without further ado, our speakers in order of appearance are Professor Gail Whiteman, who is known to many who've worked with her as Gail Force, and you'll soon find out why. She is an expert on global risk arising from systemic changes occurring in the natural environment. Gail is founder of the Arctic Basecamp and Professor of Sustainability at the University of Exeter's Business School in the UK. She's a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on Frontier Risk, and she's Professor in Residence at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Julienne Stroeve, who earned her PhD in Geography from the University of Colorado Boulder for her work in understanding Greenland's climate variability. She was Senior Research Scientist at the National Snow and Ice Data Centre and a Professor at University College London. She's also been awarded a Canada 150 Excellence Research Chair at the University of Manitoba. Next up, we'll hear from Dr. Jennifer Francis, and I just want to say how wonderful it is to see science represented so strongly by women on today's call. Dr. Francis is a Senior Scientist at the Woodwell Climate Research Centre in Falmouth, Massachusetts. She spent 24 years as a research professor in the Department of Marine and Coastal Sciences at Rutgers University, where she studied the Arctic climate system and how rapid Arctic change is affecting the areas beyond the Arctic, particularly extreme weather in the Northern Hemisphere. And then we'll hear from Nigel Topping, the inimitable UK's high-level climate action champion, who was appointed by the UK Prime Minister in January 2020. And Nigel's job is to strengthen collaboration and drive action from businesses, investors, organisations, cities and regions on climate change, and coordinate that work with governments and parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So Gail, this has been a tumultuous year for many reasons that we're all mostly familiar with. But I understand it's been an especially tumultuous year in the Arctic. So I'm handing over to you now to sound the Arctic alarm. Over to you, Gail.
Great, thanks Zoe, and thanks for everybody who's joining the call today. Arctic Basecamp, the role that we play is we try to speak science to power. So we're a science communication pop-up because we've learned over time that it's not enough just to do great science. We actually have to get it out there and talk to both the press, but also people that have power. We know that it's been a crazy year for all of us, but in particular, we've seen the data that's coming out of the Arctic to show that while we've all been focused on the pandemic, the Arctic, of course, continues to be in crisis. The concern, though, for us today is not that just the Arctic is in crisis for Arctic countries or for many species that live in that region and people, but it's also affecting all of us and our lives throughout the world. So what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay there. And indeed, both from a moral perspective, but also from an economic perspective, that poses significant risk for the rest of the world. The research that my team has done using integrated assessment modeling, when we try to assess what happens to our economy if we lose Arctic summer sea ice and have permafrost thaw, and the numbers that are coming out from that analysis show that the cost of that, even if we reach the current NDCs, is well over $60 trillion on a discounted rate. So it's expensive to lose the Arctic in terms of how we've run our economies. And on top of that, it really affects the rest of the world. And my fellow scientists will go through the natural science details of that. But from my perspective, all I can say from a global risk perspective is that the Arctic is the barometer of global risk, and it's in crisis. So we have decided to sound the Arctic alarm, and we're doing it during the UNGA week, particularly because there's 4 key things that we think world leaders need to really think about when they are having their discussions this week. The first is that they need to put scientists and science right at the heart of the decision making. We've seen how useful that is with the pandemic, and we really need to make sure that scientists are at the table. And it's not a political discussion, but it's a political discussion based on scientific data and facts. So I think that's absolutely key. That's what we're sounding the alarm for. The second thing, though, is it's got to be more than just looking at the alarm. There has to be action. And we want world leaders this week and over the next 18 months to really adopt and unite behind this science and make sure that they have early and ambitious increases to their NDCs, and also ensure that the COVID economic recovery packages that are on the table now and will increasingly grow are actually low carbon compliant. And we know that a Bloomberg NEF study is showing that indeed that's not the case. Most of the COVID economic recovery funds that are out there are not low carbon compliant, and that's extra bad news for the Arctic, which means it's extra bad news for us. Third point, we encourage all the companies out there to actually unite behind the science and make sure that they have science-based targets to ensure that their production and consumption that we all use is going to reach the 1.5 degree target. And the final thing is that we are urging all world leaders to unite behind the science and help us raise the alarm on the Arctic and actually get solutions on the table. So, and I'd now like to turn it back to Zoe, and then we'll go into the actual details of that science. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gail. It was really striking to hear you say the words, "It's expensive to lose the Arctic." And you repeated a few times the phrase that we need leaders to unite behind the science. So let's get straight into the science. Julienne, I know that you're a real expert, and you can talk to us very clearly about the record high temperatures we've been seeing in the Arctic this year, and especially to the ever increasing sea ice melt, including the ice melt on Greenland. So over to you to give us the science on what's really going on.
Yeah, well, you know, I have to say this was quite an interesting year in the Arctic, because I was in the Arctic over winter as part of the year-long Mosaic expedition. And this winter, temperatures were not particularly warm in the winter. We were typically running -30 to -40. And as a result, the sea ice cover was not that unusually low this winter. And, you know, so if you're heading into summer, you may have thought, well, you know, might not be such a record low year, but then we had these very unusually warm, in fact, record warm temperatures that happened over Siberia this spring and early summer. And that part of the Arctic was already quite vulnerable to melting out. And that's actually what we saw really early in the melt season, is the sea ice along the Eurasian coast started to retreat quite early. And part of that was the ice was very thin to begin with. Even though we had quite a bit of ice growth over winter, We also had very strong winds that pushed a lot of ice towards the pole over winter, which created a lot of new ice formation along the coastal areas of Siberia. So that ice melted away very, very quickly. And even for parts of the summer, we were tracking at record low conditions. So sort of end of June, beginning of July, we were actually tracking below 2012. And it certainly seemed like we could have had a new record low this year. But of course, you know, whether you have a new record low from one year to the next is in part driven by weather patterns. So if you have winds that push the ice further north, or if you have winds that bring in really warm temperatures, you can melt out a lot more ice. This summer wasn't particularly unusual, except for that warmth that we saw on the Siberian side of the Arctic. And we had some old ice hanging on in the Beaufort Sea this summer. So if that old ice had melted out, we would have had a new record low for sure. But really what this summer does is it kind of puts a nail in the coffin in some ways on this long-term decline, because that's what we're really interested in. We're not so interested in whether or not we break another record low from one year to the next, because it is partly driven by weather patterns, but the long-term decline is very closely linked to global warming from increases in greenhouse gases. And we've been able to show this just looking at the observations and also at climate model studies. And, you know, we've been able to sort of quantify that for every metric ton of CO2 we add to the atmosphere, we can melt 3 square meters of sea ice. So we can start translating that directly to emissions from every country, for example. So if we look at emissions for China in 2019, they would have been responsible for melting 30,000 square kilometers of sea ice last year. The US would be about half that, around 15,000 square kilometers. But we can start looking at how every country is actually contributing to sea level loss, sea ice loss in the Arctic. And globally, I guess we could really say that about 100,000 square kilometers of sea ice loss last year would have been due to greenhouse gas emissions from the planet. In terms of Greenland melt this year, it was a bit of a mixed bag. We had some areas of the ice sheet that were way above average. So in the northeastern part of the ice sheet and the southwestern part of the ice sheet, we saw much more melt than average. But then we saw less melt in the northwestern part and the southeastern part. So it was a bit of a mixed bag. But overall, I mean, Greenland is still losing mass. It's not replenishing its mass from snowfall in the wintertime. So we're still losing more from melting every summer. And this, of course, is contributing to global sea level rise. So the Arctic is still doing what we expect, and we've known this was going to happen as we continue to warm the planet in response to adding more greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. And, you know, when we look at the observations and we look at our climate models, they're all starting to line up and be in closer agreement now that within the next 20 years, we're looking at a transition from an Arctic Ocean that was covered by sea ice to one that will be largely ice-free in the summertime. And this will have a whole host of implications both within the Arctic and beyond the Arctic. And I know Jennifer will probably talk about that. So I will let her talk about the implications of why this is so important.
Thank you so much, Julienne. And it's really hard to hear words like a nail in the coffin when we're talking about the life of ice, sea ice in the Arctic, and what that means in terms of long-term decline, and that within 20 years we could be looking at a completely different Arctic. So I would just really love now to hear from Jennifer. People are experiencing extreme weather events across the world now. Can you help us to connect what Julienne was talking about to what we're seeing all around the world?
Well, I'll certainly try. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Julienne. Thank you, Gail, for those really disturbing comments. We are indeed looking at an Arctic that is changing extremely rapidly. It's warming extremely rapidly, and it really does matter for all of us. Some of the reasons are that because we're losing all of this ice and snow, both snow and ice are disappearing really rapidly. That ice and snow is very bright, and so it reflects most of the sun's energy that hits it. So by losing it, we're actually making the Arctic darker, we're making the Earth darker. And the reason that matters is because now, instead of reflecting all of that sun's energy back to outer space where it would never influence our climate system, it's instead going into the Arctic Ocean, it's warming the Arctic Ocean, it's melting even more ice and snow, and this sets up this vicious cycle of warming and melting. And the reason that's important is because by absorbing all that extra heat into the oceans, we are actually exacerbating the global warming impact by something like 25 to 40%. That's how much warmer the globe is now, just because we're losing that ice and snow. But that's not all. So by warming the Arctic really fast, we're also accelerating the melt of the land ice, which are the glaciers and the Greenland ice sheet that Julienne mentioned. And so we're accelerating the pace of sea level rise. That extra warming is also accelerating the thaw of permafrost, where permafrost is the ice that's embedded in the soils up in the high latitudes. And when that permafrost thaws, it allows the microbes in the soil to start eating the organic matter that's in there. And when they do that, they release additional carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere, which are of course greenhouse gases. So that by itself is exacerbating the global warming as well. And then finally, by warming the Arctic faster than areas to the south, we are reducing the difference in temperature between the north and the south. That difference in temperature is really important because it's the main fuel that drives the jet stream. The jet stream is this river of wind that encircles the northern hemisphere, and it's responsible for developing and also steering the winds of the storms and the high pressure areas and all the weather that we experience in the northern hemisphere. So anything that changes what the jet stream is doing is going to affect our weather patterns all around the northern hemisphere. And as you know, we've already seen a very interesting year, shall I say, in 2020 in terms of extreme weather events. And we've seen just devastating and unprecedented fires, not just in our western states, but also the north in Siberia, in Scandinavia, but all across Brazil and Argentina and other places as well. So it's been just a devastating year for forest fires, which are we call them wildfires, but in fact, they're not really wild anymore. They have a huge fingerprint of human impact. And climate change and Arctic warming is a big part of that because it's exacerbating the heat waves and the droughts that are really preparing or conditioning those areas for extreme fires. So overall, we're seeing the kinds of extreme events connected to the Arctic. We are doing research on this. This is a very rapid moving field of research. And the bottom line is that by affecting the jet stream the way we are, by the Arctic melting and warming so fast, we're seeing that weather patterns are actually becoming more persistent. They're lasting longer. And this leads to the kinds of extremes that are caused by by long-lived weather patterns. So you can think of drought, for example, heat waves, even cold spells and stormy periods. And what we've seen overall is that since about 1980, so over the last 40 years, we've seen the kinds of extreme events related to weather actually tripling. The frequency of those events is tripling over that very short time period. And certainly part of that is because of the effects of the Arctic on the jet stream. And we expect that to continue as the ice continues to melt, as Julienne said. So, thanks.
Jennifer, thank you very much for that. It's all very alarming.
Depressing news, right?
It's very sobering, and we're clearly up against an intricately interconnected cascade of impacts. So it all starts to make sense in the way you're talking about it. The Arctic Basecamp slogan of what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. So Nigel, as someone who's corralling the real economy to react to this science and come together in an international dialogue, for COP26. Can you put this into context when we're thinking about the real economy and what this means for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change process and the meeting that will happen next November?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks to Gail, Julienne and Jennifer for the very sobering summary. I think there are a few things here. First of all, we have really entered the area where the impacts of climate change are here and now. You know, I just think of sort of ABC of extreme weather events. You know, the Arctic's melting, Bangladesh is drowning, California is burning, and you could probably fill the whole alphabet. So the plus side of that is it actually the visceral nature of these extreme weather events, the tripling that Jennifer talks about, makes it attracts attention and makes people listen to the science more. You know, the IPCC 1.5 degree report, which really spelled out that every month and every fraction of a degree that we can do better than net zero by 2050 will mean less economic damage and less human damage, really had a galvanizing effect on, I think, many, not just the global economic community, but many others. I think civil society, I think it was a trigger for some of the real expressions of frustration and anger and fear. But it's also seen a real rising up of the level of businesses committing to science-based targets, as Gail said, and at a much more ambitious level. So, and I think a lot of this is about the clarity of the science and the galvanizing, the sort of crystal clarity of a zero target. It really helps to be focused on zero, not 65 or 80. Because there's nowhere to hide, right? And it's really about really transformational. I think the other thing that's very present in boardrooms and in cabinet offices is the increasing understanding of the risk management challenge, that not only has the likelihood of extreme weather events gone up, but also our understanding of the impact. I mean, if you look at the history of the IPCC reports, every report for the same degree of warming explains a higher level of understood risk. And now that the COP's been delayed until next November, we'll have more IPCC reports coming out, not all of them, but some of them before. And I expect those to once more trigger a raised understanding of just how much the risks that we're running are higher than we understood before, and as well as more likely. I was thinking in risk management terms, or, you know, most governments, investors, businesses and charities even have a audit and risk management process that looks at risk on the dimensions of likelihood and impact. And we're seeing a complete failure of global risk management going from bottom left to top right. And that's why we're seeing an exponential growth in the numbers of cities, businesses, investors, and countries now committing to net zero, but 2050 at the latest, some of them 2045, 2040, even 2030. If you look at some of the cities. So the sense of urgency is really ramping up. That's why Gonzalo Munoz, my Chilean high-level champion, and I launched the Race to Zero, because this really is a race, and not against each other, but one we all win or lose together. And I think that so what we're seeing now is and we've just seen a doubling in the number of organisations committed to a net zero target and plan within the last 12 months. So it's really changing fast. I think for you know, for CEOs and for people seeking high elected offices, taking the science seriously and putting in place very clear plans, not just long-term targets, but plans in the next 5 to 10 years that demonstrate and put us on track to halving emissions at least by 2030, so that we have a chance of landing below 1.5 degrees, even though we at the same time have to do a lot of work to adapt to the changes which are not going to wind back. We know that we'll be left with more and extremer weather events, even if we stay within the 1.5 degrees. So that the level of attention that I'm seeing and really not necessarily intuitively in the face of the COVID crisis, we've actually seen, I think, a lot of sort of resolve to ramp up ambition and action on the climate crisis. And of course, we're now getting to the end of 2020 when countries were scheduled to submit their revised NDCs, as Gail says, And we will see some. I'm very hopeful we'll see the EU and the UK come in before the end of the year with bold NDCs, which are on track to net zero by 2050. And then we hope that many other countries join them. And then, of course, some governments have had to delay because of the amount of bandwidth that's been occupied by COVID. But actually, I'm increasingly confident that, in fact, the delay of the COP will see more ambition come in between now and November 2026, November 2021, COP26, when the world's governments come together. And remember, just last thing to say about the COP is not going to renegotiate the global climate treaty. The multilateral business of the COP is completing the rule book of Paris and making sure that previous commitments have been met. That's really important, but just as important is what governments commit to between now and then, and what businesses and investors and cities and regions commit to between now and then. So we don't have to wait to the COP. This is a crescendo. Every day, every week that goes by, we need to see more ambition and more action from every actor, from every citizen, from every school, from every business, from every investor, from every city, and from every country. So that's what I'm working with Gonzalo and many, many others around the world, to see that ambition ratcheting up so that our combined ambition matches the challenge that the science makes very, very clear. Thank you, Zoe.
Thank you so much, Nigel. It's really encouraging to hear about the rapid growth of interest in net zero and this application of a race mentality, because the urgency that we've heard about today is obviously really clear. We're now open for questions for our expert speakers. So if anybody on the line would like to ask a question to the speakers, please use the chat window to type your question and make sure that you indicate who your question is for. And while you're all thinking about your questions and putting them together, I'd just like to kick us off by asking Gail about this call for leaders to unite behind the science. Nigel was explaining that we've got a bit more time now. We'll have some more scientific data coming through. Our understanding is improving every day. The visceral nature of what we're seeing helps us with this sense of urgency. But scientists have been sounding the alarm on climate change for a very long time. Why is it that now they might listen? And do you really think that our leaders can and will unite behind the science?
Well, thanks, Zoe. So first of all, I think that scientists have been sounding the alarm on a lot of things for a long time and often are not listened to. We've seen that with the pandemic, that the medical science community had warned of this for many, many years. And in fact, there were some robust plans or scenarios put into place, and most world leaders did not at all plan for this or listen to this kind of science. Those that maybe had been affected by SARS or MERS were better prepared, but by and large, the science was ignored. So it wasn't an unknown, but it was let's just say, wish it won't happen. And I think this year we've clearly seen that what appeared to be impossible, if you don't listen to science, does happen. And I think from that, there has been a massive, massive learning taking place, both from the C-suite of major companies around the world, but also with government. So the belief in science has increased, I'd say. We see scientists standing on stage with ministers making pledges to actually keep humanity safe. So if we can rip off that and say that the issue of climate science and climate risk is even larger than the risk that we see with the pandemic, because in many cases those are tipping points that once we're past, like if we lose the Arctic summer sea ice, we're not necessarily going to get back again. So the risks are ongoing and perhaps unrecoverable. So we've also seen that governments can put the economy ahead, put humanity ahead of the economy in a short-term sense. So realizing that we're in it together, that this is a systemic risk we have to adjust. So we are hoping that now, given the fact that even with the small amounts of CO2 that we saved this year, the Arctic is still melting, it's still in trouble, still in crisis, extreme weather's, just going, crazy everywhere, that we think now is the time they have to really listen. Also, the reason why now it's important to sound the alarm and have people listen to that alarm is that the money that would be pumped in with COVID economic recovery is a huge amount of funding. And that, of course, is a huge opportunity. We could move that towards the low carbon economy and really galvanize and fast track things that we thought would take much longer. Or we can just bolster business as usual and basically put an end game in place where we cannot recover by 2030. So from a scientific perspective, this is the time now. It has never been more important, and it's a once in a generation time, I think, to actually get serious and face up to these global risks and deal with them.
Thank you, Gail. And I wanted to sort of touch on this point about now is the moment, and we've been talking about COP26, and Dr. Stroeve, you talked about the fact that now it's possible to attribute a sizable chunk of ice melt to a particular country based on their emissions that we understand. And I wonder if improved communication around that, or a raised awareness of understanding of the linkages, direct linkages between a country's emissions and what that does in the Arctic, could be helpful in bringing this urgency to the fore.
You know, to me, I think it's very useful to try to translate it into sort of, you know, concrete metrics that policymakers can understand. And part of it is also, it's not that the Arctic cares about time, it really cares about how much more CO2 we keep adding to the atmosphere. And so, you know, when policymakers are asking, okay, well, when will the Arctic become ice-free? It's really a matter of, well, how much more CO2 are we going to add to the atmosphere before this happens? What is the global warming that we'll go through before this happens? And, you know, so those provide a more tangible target, I think, to make informed policy decisions. So given our current emission rates, which are around 35 to 40 gigatons of carbon per year, we can see that if we add another 700 gigatons of carbon to the atmosphere, the Arctic Ocean starts to go ice-free because of this linear relationship that we see between greenhouse gases and sea ice loss. Similarly, we can also do this in terms of global warming because, of course, there's that linear relationship between global warming and CO2. And you could look at a target of around 1.7 degrees Celsius of global warming. But as Jennifer mentioned, I mean, if you're looking at, you know, 1.5 to 2 degrees global warming, you're looking at 7 to 9 degrees of warming in the Arctic during autumn and winter. So this warming is not equal. And then, you know, all of these implications that Jennifer talked about with, you know, increased melting at places like Greenland or increased permafrost thaw, those are going to be happening at temperatures that are much larger than the global warming that we'll see, because the Arctic is going to warm that much faster. So I think we really need to consider, like, even when we think about these targets of what the global planet will experience in terms of warming, the Arctic is going to warm a lot more than that. And the implications are much larger there.
Thank you very much. And that leads us nicely into a question we have here from Marina Eisen that I want to ask Jennifer to answer first. But this relates to the rapidly melting ice. And as the ice in the Arctic melts, the rush to build infrastructure is on too. And Reuters reported on Friday that there is a possible Arctic LNG project being pushed by several countries, with the French government set to debate its investment soon. So if the French government was consulting you, what would you say are the impacts on this to the Arctic and beyond of such a project?
Well, you know, in the big picture sense, I would say that any resources spent on additional infrastructure that enables additional fossil fuel burning is a bad idea. It's not the future. It's not what we should be doing. LNG is, of course, liquid natural gas, and that sounds very innocuous, but it is indeed a fossil fuel. And so I think it's going in the wrong direction to build any infrastructure, whether it's pipelines or LNG storage or, you know, drilling in the Arctic, drilling anywhere for that matter. We should be investing that money in other sources of energy that can replace fossil fuel energy sources and not building more of them. I mean, that said, we know that the loss of Arctic sea ice and especially the sea ice, though, is making it easier for people to go up there and exploit these opportunities. There is oil there, there's natural gas there, and so it's attractive. Although it's, you know, the ice is still going to be there in the winter. It's still going to be a risky and expensive place to exploit these natural resources. We don't have the infrastructure up there to deal with an accident of some sort, whether it's an oil spill or a big storm that damages some kind of an installation where there are people. So I'd say there's really no upside other than the fact that you know, companies want to make more money, and but doing it by increasing our fossil fuel infrastructure, in my opinion, is just the wrong direction to be going in.
Thank you, Jennifer. Gail, I know you wanted to come in on this question as well.
I did. Thank you, Marina, for that question. I think it's really important, and it's an example that many world leaders will be faced with, is how do they balance this idea of getting energy, boosting the economy again, and actually, you know, fixing climate change. But I just like to say that, you know, the French government has been such a leader on this transition towards the low carbon economy. You know, when we look at the Paris Agreement, that was historic and very much to do with the French governmental policymakers that shepherded through that process in such a remarkable way, in addition, of course, with many others. And I think the whole world was with President Macron when he said, let's make the planet great again, after the US announced that they would be taking themselves out of the Paris Agreement. So in no way could this project be financed by French government money and unite behind the science. It's just an impossibility. And I think that would be a very, very sad thing for the scientific community and the world community to see coming out of France.
Thank you, Gail. We had a question, just a reminder, if you do want to ask a question, the easiest way is to put your question in the chat. But in the meantime, we got a question via email from Marie Noel. She said, late August, scientists estimated that melting ice in the Arctic had reached a point of no return. Do you share this statement? Does that mean there's nothing left to do? And I'd like to ask Dr. Stroeve to answer that, and then I'll ask Nigel to come in afterwards, if that's okay.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a really good question. And I mean, I think it's a bit of a difficult question to answer. In part because we know, you know, if we were to run our climate model simulations and we lose all the Arctic sea ice in the summertime, and yet we cool the planet down, we stop adding more CO2, the ice will come back. So it doesn't appear to be an irreversible process, at least in the climate model simulations that have been done to see if you can bring it back after it disappears in the summer. But on the other hand, at the moment on our emission trajectories, whether we're looking at 1.5 or 2 degrees of warming at the moment, the amount of emissions and the warming that we're going to do over the next 20 years is pretty much the same at the moment. So given that, and given the fact that the sea ice is largely going to become ice-free in the summertime, it doesn't really matter too much what trajectory we follow at this point. So we did a paper that was published earlier this year that actually looked at this in the new climate models that will go into the next IPCC report. And regardless of which emission scenario we followed, we were going to lose the ice. At least, you know, some years, and then maybe not every single year, but of course, if we add more warming, then we will keep it ice-free. But on the other hand, you know, obviously choosing reduced emission scenarios could sort of lead to somewhat of a recovery. Maybe we could bring conditions back to what we're seeing today. It's not likely that we're going to go back to what we saw 30, 40 years ago. I mean, we're in a very new Arctic state at the moment, climate state. So it's really hard to imagine that we can go back to what we had 30 to 40 years ago. But I do think that we're going to have to get innovative in terms of not just reducing our CO2 emissions, but also starting to take CO2 out of the atmosphere if we really want to remove the possibility that the Arctic Ocean will become ice-free in the near future.
Thank you. Nigel, how do you respond to the question about, does it mean there's nothing left to do?
Well, that's a counsel of doom. I mean, that's really just not an intelligent response to say there's nothing left to do, because that's actually welcoming the apocalypse, basically, isn't it? So anybody who says that really hasn't read the science. There's a lot to do, and we need to do it fast. And the one thing I would also say is that we're going to be careful with sort of anchoring in 2050. It's a somewhat arbitrary date. It's been important for translating things, as colleagues talked about earlier, to simple messages, but not everything has to be done by December the 31st, 2050, right? Some stuff can be done much faster. And actually, we tend to really surprise ourselves as humans with our ability to innovate really fast. So let me get my favorite example is when the dust settled on the Paris Agreement, 5 years ago. Most people thought that we'd still be building internal combustion engine cars into 2060, 2070. That's what the IEA thought, the kind of normative scenarios. We now know that it's game over for combustion engines in the 2030s, probably by 2030, because the innovation, the exponential cost down on batteries and the exponential market share up on electric vehicles means that things take a lot longer to start than we think. That's you go from 0.01 to 0.02, you're doubling, but it's not much different. But you go from 2 to 4 to 8 to 16%. Suddenly, it's game over. So I think we should be, really avoid councils of doom, because they're really welcoming. That actually, then the people who indulge in councils of doom are complicit in a slowing down of action, actually, which means more economic damage and more human tragedy. So we have to remain committed to doing everything we can as fast as we can. And human systems are complex and they take time to change, but we do have ability to tap into exponential change processes, and then things can happen much more quickly than we ever imagined. I think what we're seeing now with finally a very broad adoption of the need to get to zero fast is an example of a cultural exponential change. We're seeing cities and companies committing to net zero 2030. Like 1 week ago, we had I think 14 of the world's airlines committing to net zero 2050, when the whole industry was saying we'll only get to 50% by 2050. So there's real step changes in ambition, but saying there's nothing we can do has no place in an agenda of action and of effective change going forward.
Thank you, Nigel. And thinking about the things that we can do, one of the evolving areas of activism is happening in the courts. And that's a very interesting development for the climate movement. And there's a question here for Julienne from Alistair Doyle. Do you know of any lawsuits looking at melting ice and sea level rise? And exactly how do you ascribe blame? Do you count historic emissions back to pre-industrial times? Or just since the 1990s, when the IPCC first said the balance of evidence suggests a human cause? Is there any movement to put a price on melted ice?
Well, that's a very good question. I am not aware of any recent lawsuits. I know there was some efforts in the past by indigenous communities of the Arctic, but I don't know where things stand with any of those lawsuits at the moment. I will say that I was at a meeting last year in Washington, D.C. with a lot of indigenous representatives, and they want the Western world to be held accountable for what's happening, because their lives are being really adversely impacted by climate change that is being caused by those of us in the Western world. So I think there are efforts, but I'm not aware of any particular case that I could point to at this point. Maybe others on the panel do know. In terms of, when we're looking at our relationships between sea ice loss and amount of CO2 that's been added to the atmosphere, we're usually working with the entire satellite data record. So that starts in 1979, but we've also looked at earlier data records going back to 1953, because that's our most reliable period of observation. So when I am establishing these relationships between CO2 and sea ice loss, I'm using a much longer time series, not just since 1990, to look at that relationship. And in the climate models, I can go back even farther, because they're simulating both the CO2 responses and the amount of sea ice change. The one thing I would say is that in all of these climate models, if you run these models with pre-industrial levels of greenhouse gases, none of them can simulate the decline that we're seeing. So this is despite the fact that they would all be in their own phase of natural climate variability. So they could be showing increases or decreases as a result of just internal variability in the climate system, but none of them can capture the decline unless you put in the observed record of greenhouse gases. And this is one way that we really also can say with certainty that the greenhouse gases is driving this long-term change that we see. See what the other question was. Is there a movement to put a price on melted ice? I don't think there is yet, not that I am aware of. I'm not sure if anybody else is aware of something like that.
Thank you. Before I ask Gail to wrap up the call, I just wanted to come back to Jennifer on this topic of, Nigel was talking about doom, that this concept of doom, and the fact that asking whether there's anything left that we can do means that we're not listening to the science. There's always a case for action in the face of what we're up against. For those people who are in the world right now, in the midst of some of the impacts that you described, and that Nigel called the ABCs of climate impacts, this interconnected cascade of impacts that's happening right now, how do you talk about tipping points? And do you think that the Arctic as this barometer is pushing tipping points that could be irreversible elsewhere? Or do we have a chance to pull back from those things as well?
Yep, well, that's another great question. I think the answer is similar to the one that Julienne gave for the ice. We're, a tipping point implies a cliff-like thing that we're going to fall off and we can't climb back up again. But in fact, it's more of a steady onward progression or a trend that we're seeing, and not this sudden change. I think people are starting to recognize that their own backyards, their own environments are changing in ways that they have no prior experience with. Even older people, they say, wow, this, we've never seen this before. And so I think there's a realization now that we haven't seen really up until very recently, that that people know that things are not normal. And it doesn't matter where you live, whether it's you're on the east coast of the US, where we've seen a record number of tropical storms this year. We know that tropical storms are being affected by climate change, and even the Arctic, because the Arctic is helping to make the globe warmer. It's making sea levels higher, so that when a tropical storm does come, that storm surge is going to be even worse. And by exacerbating global warming, we're seeing that these tropical storms can intensify faster, and we're seeing more strong tropical storms. So this does have a tie back to the Arctic as well. We know that the drought and the heat waves that have been exacerbating the fires this year also have a fingerprint of the Arctic because of these increasing persistent weather conditions. But I do think that while we cannot turn this trend around that we're seeing, we can make the trend less steep. We can make the extreme weather events of the future maybe less extreme or less frequent if we can reduce our emissions of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. That really is the disease that we're facing here. And by addressing the disease, we're going to be able to make the symptoms less bad in the future.
Thank you, Jennifer. And I'm just going to sneak one question in for Nigel, who talked about exponentials earlier. And I know that this is something that you are looking at, particularly you were talking about end of the internal combustion engine and so on. But given what you've heard from today's scientists, do you think that the change that we need at the pace that we need it is achievable to stay within the realms of what was defined in the Paris Agreement and what humanity needs to survive and thrive?
I think so, but for all my positivity about doubling the number of organizations who've committed to net zero, that's still a tiny fraction of the total number of businesses and investors. We have $5 trillion of investments committed to net zero. That needs to be 10x. We have 1,000 companies. That needs to be 1 million companies. So yes, I still think it's possible. Of course, I'm not saying it's easy or it's possible to go back to, because we're gonna if we can stay within 1.5 degrees, we still have the 3 or more, Jennifer, I guess, by then, times the increase of extreme weather events. So it's not, yes, we can mitigate and everything will be fine and dandy. It's like, yes, we can mitigate if we all lend our shoulders to the wheel, and we have to adapt to become resilient in the face of these extreme weather events, which are both more extreme and more frequent. So yes, we can stay below 1.5 degrees, especially if we back ourselves and set those bold targets and set the engineers free. All right, engineers based on good science know how to innovate. It's what they exist to do. Give them the problems, enshrine them in policy and in business and investment targets, and then we can do it.
Thanks, Nigel. Gail, would you like to provide us all with some final comments before we wrap this up?
Great, thanks, Zoe. Well, thank you everybody for both participating and listening to what we had to say today. I think the science is clear. The Arctic is in crisis, and that crisis poses significant economic and social risks and environmental risks for the rest of the world. There's no way we can avoid looking at that, and by sounding the alarm, we are attempting to get world leaders to integrate science into every investment and finance decision that they make. We cannot have our cake and eat it too. We have to fast forward to a low carbon world, and sounding the Arctic alarm is one way that science is going to demand accountability. We hope to see you, Nigel, in Glasgow. We'll set up Arctic Basecamp there, and we'll bring you an update on where we are in the world. But what can we say is that this is real, it's happening now, it's a crisis, and that emergency situation must be dealt with. Thank you.
Thank you, Gail. And for everybody joining, just a reminder that the recording will be available on the Arctic Basecamp website, arcticbasecamp.org/media. And the Arctic Basecamp team are holding another Zoom conference this afternoon, which will start at 5 p.m. UK time with the same speakers we've had today, but also joined by Rain Wilson and Julia Jackson. So there'll be a bit of a different viewpoint on all of this. If you're able to join, you can register to attend that event by emailing media@arcticbasecamp.org. Thank you to our excellent speakers for speaking science to us and explaining it so well, and to Nigel for pulling together the community of real economy actors and connecting that to what governments need to do. I'm glad you had a chance to join us today and hear this, and that marks the end of this press conference. Thank you very much, everybody. Bye-bye.